Continuing the research designs in the sales psychology, we have completed in the previous podcasting the experimental design, and the final comment was the discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of the experimental design. Just recap: experimental design equals lab situation equals random allocation of the participants into groups, the control and the experiment group, equals independent variable manipulated by the researcher in order to observe the effect this independent variable has on to the dependent variable. So we actually are reporting the way the dependent variable is responding. On the right side of the website, you can see the observational design, mainly the quantitative, as per our syllabus, and the qualitative designs, which include not only rich verbal responses that really can be meaningful and go to the depth of the person's psyche, but really is the best way to understand behaviors, compare not only precise numerical data, but go deeper in meaningful inferences and comparisons. So, whereas the observational design quantifies the behaviors, and the difference between the experimental design and the quantitative design is that the independent variable is pre-existing, so we don't manipulate it. The qualitative design is focusing via focus group or Delphi technique to differences between groups and association between the variables. And of course, these designs, the qualitative designs, although they're called qualitative designs, they can gather quantitative and qualitative data. The SACE exams avoid to call these designs qualitative, implying there is no quality in these two designs. Usually, when they ask questions about focus group and Delphi technique. I want you to remember that almost every year, in one or another way, there is need to answer a question that relates to the Delphi technique or the focus group. So be aware that you need to study again in here advantages and disadvantages of the observational designs, and advantages and disadvantages of the focus group as well as the Delphi technique. Sometimes similarities can be asked, and at the end you will be asked to compare quantitative and qualitative investigation designs. So you really need to know, and that's why I have requested you to do that in your table. You are needing to know the characteristics of its design plus advantages and disadvantages. Be aware that if you have that in your mind plus an example, you will be ready to ace the exams. So now we are going to discussing the last two remaining designs. We start with observational design, B, quantitative or qualitative data collecting, and then we're going to discuss focus group and Delphi technique methods of collecting psychological data or behavioral data. Observational design. The quantitative observational design has specific features. First things first, the researcher observes the behavior in a natural environment. Okay, so and the researcher observes the variation of this natural behavior, which is of interest to the research, for the research question. What I want to make clear is that it's natural to observe children. However, if observing children in their natural environment, the researcher can identify that girls are less violent when they watch violent video games, compared to the boys, this is an observational design, ethical and purposely made to observe people in their natural environments and can quantify the findings and the measurements. So they can quantify that girls who watch violent videos for 4 hours a day, they are 5 in the scale of 1 to 10 violent. The boys who watch 4 hours violent games or play 5 hours violent games a day, they are 8 in the scale of 1 to 10 in violent behavior after the game. So this kind of quantitative observational design we are discussing. So in these cases, the independent variable is pre-existing, so we don't need to manipulate. So what's the independent variable in the scenario I described earlier? Is the hours of playing games or the gender? We're going to discuss this in the class. I hope you understand that independent variable is the one that theoretically is manipulated, okay, in the lab. In the natural setting, you don't need to manipulate it, it's pre-existing. So we don't need to manipulate it. So we were going to discuss on this. These observational designs are made to investigate the difference between groups, girls, boys, 8-year-old girls, 10-year-old boys, smokers, non-smokers, and the key, another characteristic of the observational design, is that the groups are pre-existing, so it's much easier to observe them, because you don't invite them ask them to participate in an unethical situation, like exposing children in violent games. For example, forcing students to skip breakfast to observe, that will be unethical. Forcing them to be sleepless, that will be unethical. Find association between variables, it's very important, and that's part of correlation studies. And also it's very important that in this kind of designs we can investigate unique or very hard to find in huge numbers cases, which we call case studies. Now, I want you to understand the difference between the experimental design and the quantitative observational design. we consider that experimental design is by definition quantitative. Main difference, we already said, is the pre-existing treatment of pre-existing independent variable into groups, and we don't need to manipulate it. For example, if I want to compare boys and girls and their memory, the gender is pre-existing. I don't force somebody to act like a male, although it's a female. So in this case, when I observe the behavior and the way they remember things, boys and girls, I don't manipulate anything. So if we go back to my example here with the video games, do you remember now? Can you understand now what is the pre-existing independent variable, that it's not manipulated because it is there? Yes. The fact that my groups are boys and girls, and they are both control groups. I don't have experiment and control group. Finding attitudes to smoking, it's also a pre-existing variable, but it's not manipulated because people were smoking before the research starts. I want you to remember that quantitative observational designs have many features of the true experiment, but the difference is that, and that's a disadvantage as well, and I want you to remember that as a difference, that in the pre-existing groups, in the pre-existing formulation of these groups, there is space of many extraneous variables, such as participants' individual characteristics. So, if I want you to remember one problem for the observational design, is that observational designs, exactly because they have groups that are pre-existing, are subject to participants' characteristics problems. Last but not least, we need to discuss advantages and disadvantages of the quantitative observational design. Advantages first. The quantitative design allow variables to be investigated that in every other case could be unethical or impossible or too costly to observe them in a lab. So, why they are costly? Because you have to set up a situation that's similar. But when you observe this situation in their natural setting, that's another case. Some kinds of behaviors are not possible to be observed in the lab. We need to observe them in the natural environment. For example, there is no way I can study children that are abused emotionally or physically in an ethical manner. However, observing the behavior and finding common themes of behavior and characteristics and quantifying somehow by rating scales, by reports, by thematic approach and frequencies, the way the performance in a test, the way these children are behaving, acting, feeling, I can generalize my findings. Disadvantages. We cannot infer that A variable will cause this effect to the B situation. So we cannot infer relationships. It's the major psychological problem. Correlation does not mean causation. Yes, there is a relationship between this and that, but we don't know if there is the cause and effect situation. And this is because in these designs are the variables, many variables of the human character and idiosyncrasy participate and affect the results. Okay? And this is happening because usually the groups we observed are biased by definition. The children who are observed and who are abused, they have special characteristics. For example, the majority of them are children of lower education parents. They belong to lower socioeconomic status groups. So we need to make that clear, and we need to be able to observe that. Also, because every child's, in the scenario I mentioned earlier, every child's situation and case is unique, we cannot replicate the findings in exactly the same situation. They are not naturally occurring again and again and again. We can find patterns, themes, but not exactly the same situation that can be observable and replicable. The quantitative observational design does not allow therefore generalization. It's only a case study. Observer bias also may influence the results. For example, because the observer has created the whole experiment, the whole observation, looking for specific answers to a specific question, sometimes can interpret situations the way they want. In this case, I will mention the story of little Albert with some more details. I want you to remember specific characteristics. We know by now that little Albert was a child of a lady who was in the hospital. So little Albert's mum was a nurse in that hospital. In the same hospital that Watson was working. And she was working for him. So he had access to little Albert. Watson observed little Albert, and he knew that little Albert was not crying often. So he chose him because he was not crying to see when he will be scared. It is very unlikely to believe, because evidence has shown that at the time of the experiment, even from 1919, little Albert was diagnosed with hydrocephalus, which means he had liquid in his head. So when he, Watson, chose in 1920 something little Albert for the experiment, he knew that he had a child that was emotionally weak. It could be an indication of autism, but back then they didn't know autism, and at the same time it had hydrocephalus. So he was testing a sick child. The observer, Watson in that case, was biased, because in his finding, in his report, he says that Albert was a healthy boy. He was biased and he was seeing a healthy boy. Now, if the observer was biased, or if the observer was a liar, we don't know. We know that the results have been influenced. Also, when people are observed, they know that they will give results and answers that they are socially desirable. It's the idea of the demand response. I'm responding what I think they want to hear. This is another observer bias, because students like or dislike the teacher who is doing the research, or the person, the counselor who is doing the research. They respond in a specific way. The answers would be different if the observer was another person. Now if we go to the next design, the focus group and Delphi technique, I want to make sure that we need to remember the essential features. The essential feature in this case is the designs aim to create rich verbal responses and to limit the constraints of the nature of the data. That means all the people have to have the chance to respond the way they feel like it. This is the goal. However, in this case, again, there are limits in the responses because of the socially desirable answers some people give, or because some people are very afraid, scared, or feel intimidated to speak open. So sometimes, although the focus and the intention is to have full, clear data, the result is that sometimes it's not happening. The qualitative research method is very valuable because it allows humans to understand behavior in real life situations, not precise numbers that really may be biased or not true. The focus of the qualitative research is to find the answer to a question, not a hypothesis. They can find, for example, what the effects of X behavior. Okay? The hypothesis in the experiment is trying to find a cause and effect, not just the effect. Cause and effect is in the experiment. So, because X exists, the Y will increase. Because the coffee exists, my sleeplessness will be there. Also, the qualitative designs can investigate the difference, as we said, between the groups and associate these variables. I have explained that before. And we can have either qualitative or quantitative designs. We can have either qualitative or quantitative data in this focus group or Delphi technique designs. I already explained to you, my research was a qualitative design. I had frequencies and percentages. Let's say 10% of Greeks feel Australian, whereas 59% of Germans feel Australians. And this was a result of statements. So I had words and statements, and people saying, I feel Greek because it's in my blood, and then this can become a numerical value. I want you to remember that this question needs to be explained to me with examples. So you have to give me examples in class. Okay. Now, focus group. What I want you to remember in the focus group is that we have few people. Focus group has 6 to 8 participants. This is the major characteristic. And there is specific technique to obtain data through discussion, and the participants are working in a group setting where someone has to be writing, keeping the notes, and has to be the scriber, and somebody has to be the one who is conducting the research. The participants are encouraged to talk to each other, ask questions, exchange experiences, comment on other people's experiences, and try to help them. It's the most common psychiatric discussion in the movies. People are gathering into focus groups, and they speak and help each other. The idea is that the focus group is making use of open-ended discussions, open-ended questions, led by a trained facilitator. So if I want you to remember some characteristics, I want you to remember small group, obtains data through discussion in a group setting, people are talking to each other, the questions are open-ended, the discussion is led by a trained facilitator, and there is a person who is writing the answers and then collating and find themes. Advantages. It is more convenient from one-to-one interview because many people can be exchanging ideas. Rich data can be collected that, although they are rich, it's very hard to be analyzed, and that's a disadvantage at the same time. It's easy to organize, inexpensive to conduct compared to the lab. It is useful for those who cannot read or write, for example, migrants, and can encourage participants who usually cannot speak out to have a go, by saying opinion, reveal themselves. The problem is that sometimes people are really trying to conquer this discussion. Before we go and say anything else, I want you to make sure that you learn the steps and the procedures of the group and have them memorized. You have to study either in the purple or orange book. There are steps, and I want you to discuss disadvantages like these answers, the fact that the data cannot be generalized, and use all the information that you can find here on the website, on your books, and write this down on your table. So the disadvantages of the focus group is that people may not feel comfortable to express opinions in front of the others, feel intimidated. There are sometimes people who dominate the discussions. I'm one of them. I cannot stop talking. There could be an interviewer bias that can contaminate the results, so can be given leading questions or stopping the discussion going to other ways. And major is, because it's a small group, we cannot establish causation. Okay, we just see the effect. Cannot be interpreted as having generalization. They are not generalizable data. And, of course, they are not replicable. So, sometimes you can work with the opposite or using other experience, other knowledge from other designs. These are the steps I would like you to use. It's in your orange book, okay? But I want you to understand that this is not the way the focus group is conducted. It is how we are analyzing the responses of the focus group. And pay attention, this is the common mistake of the students. I have seen when marking in exams from many schools, students being asked the advantages and disadvantages of the focus group design, and they answer that people are making themes. This is wrong. Okay? And we have to keep track of themes and analyze the themes. This is wrong. This is how we analyze the responses. The next one we need to finish off with is the Delphi technique. Again, the Delphi technique is similar to the focus group, but people are not gathering in a group. So Delphi technique uses a series of questionnaires that they're self-administered, and they get feedback from experts in the field of interest to have some data with regards to the research question. So, I want you to remember that focus group is a group with open-ended questions. Delphi technique is a series of questionnaires to experts, whereas the focus group is open-ended questions in a group setting, once off. people who are not experts. So it involves 2 steps, the Delphi technique. The relevant expert individuals invited to provide open-ended opinions on a specific topic in the beginning, and then the opinions from step 1 are grouped and create a questionnaire which is redistributed among the participants as a test, self-administered test. Participants are required to rank their agreement in each statement of the questionnaire, and then the data can be quantified. The process is repeated until people get in a consensus. I don't know if you have participated. I think you have done that. Remember the way the school has decided to establish the values? Harmony, international mindedness, and the rest. 2 people came together, and then the idea of these was processed with the ideas of the others. It is a kind of Delphi technique. So they have to come in a consensus. Whereas in the focus group, people can disagree. Advantages and disadvantages. Advantages of the technique: participants are free to express their opinion, and they do really say that. Number 1, because they're experts and they're the experts in the field, and number 2, it's confidentiality and anonymity is maintained. They're not scared to express their opinion because nobody else will be seeing them except the researcher. It's a greater pool of expertise in that thing. It's not 6 to 8 people. And they compared the data from these answers can be compared with the responses in the interviews, so we have more rich data. The experts can be conducted anyway, by post, mail, so there is no limitation in the geographics, like you have to get those people who can participate in your focus group. You can send the questionnaires around the world. When I did my research, I sent the questionnaires to Greece. And the disadvantages: the researcher bias can contaminate the results. I hope you understand what this is. The problem that the questions asked initially by the researcher and the way the data are analyzed, or the way the second questions, the follow-up, have been created or incorporated in the questionnaire, could be a result of researcher bias. What the researcher wants to find is asking questions specific on this. So again, doesn't allow for generalization because we are talking about still small groups. They could be around the world, but because they're experts, it's a still small group. It's not all the population. And the consensus sometimes could be forced because people do not discuss their responses, okay? And the researcher summarizes what was the overall feeling, not the actual saying. So again, this effort to create consensus, it is problematic. As you did in the focus group, please write down the processes and 2 or 3 advantages and disadvantages and add them to your table. So if we're going to compare the quantitative and the qualitative investigation designs, I want you to understand that the qualitative research is giving us rich and deeper understanding of behaviors, and if we're making a research about meanings and experiences, this is the best, okay? Although social desirable responses and research bias are the handicaps of the way this research is done. The quantitative research, on the other side, involves data that are collected under strict, sometimes clinical, experimental conditions. So we minimize the influence of other factors, so we can establish cause and effect relationship between the variables and generalize our data in wider population. So if the research is to be more focused on the specific human behavior, then quantitative research is meaningful. And this is what we finished in this topic. The next one we're going to discuss is related to statistics, but that will be our next VOD. Thank you.